I am making this review having started at the very beginning of early access, having put over 1,600 hours into early access, and probably about just over 100 hours into the game itself. I played as a half-orc monk all the way through. I did do some testing with the different subclasses, but I stuck with a monk all the way through. I played on tactician mode with karmic dice off. So starting with character creation, generally pretty good. Do enjoy it. It follows 5th edition rules, maybe not quite exactly. Larian have made their own changes throughout, their own homebrew, most of which I do approve of. I'll get to that later. One thing I understand people are a bit upset about is the fact that there are no sliders, so there's a bit less customization for the appearance. But otherwise, it's nice. One thing I would have loved to have seen, although in the end it doesn't make much of a difference, is being able to choose your starting equipment at the beginning. But with the number of magic items we get, even from towards the beginning, that complaint becomes slightly irrelevant anyway, so it's not too bad. One thing that did change from early access to full release is actually the gods we could choose as a cleric. In early access we were able to choose some of the more evil gods like Baal or Merkel or Bane, but there doesn't really seem to be much of an option. One nice touch I have seen though is that for Dwergar they get the extra option to follow their own god, whereas the other races don't get that option to follow their god. Overall, the gameplay is absolutely amazing. Really loved it. It really does feel like being part of an actual Dungeons and Dragons group where you're making these decisions, you don't know what's going to happen, sometimes for the better, sometimes for worse. Like your choices really do matter. And you make some choices early on that affect things later, you make some choices in Act 1, and then in Act 3 something happens, without giving away any spoilers. And so that really makes me happy that we can actually have a large effect on the world. It's also really nice that we can talk away out of some bosses, so you don't have to be completely into combat, and you can make a very charismatic character and talk your way not just out of bosses but certain situations. So it's nice to have these different options and different routes through all of the encounters, or most of the encounters in the game. There's also a lot of interactivity with the environments, including both outside but also during combat. Now, speaking of combat, do bear in mind I played this game for hundreds, well, basically thousands of hours already. I didn't find tactician difficulty that difficult, and I think a lot of that is to do with my familiarity with the game and the fact I have spent such a long time playing it. And I'm not here trying to say like, ooh, I'm the best player ever, because I do know some people having difficulty with the game, even on like the Explorer difficulties, and I just put that down to familiarity with the rules, and maybe they haven't played the game for thousands of hours like some of us have. And by the time I got to the end of the game, I hadn't had a party wipe from combat. It's not that I didn't reload at any point. A couple of exploration things I really messed up. And a certain conversation, again, don't want to give any spoilers, so I won't say any more. And I did end up with quite a lot of consumables left over. During early access, I was trying to get used to using consumables, but I got into that mindset of, oof, I might need it later. And I had loads of scrolls and potions left over, and I kind of regret that, and I really wish I had used more of them, and that's down on me, not the game. And one of the reasons I found the tactician difficulty kind of slightly lacking is the AI still doesn't make great decisions sometimes. I saw them walking through surfaces, letting me provoke opportunity attacks for basically no reason, and making ranged attacks while in melee, giving themselves disadvantage. Some of the choices made really weren't that great. It's not like they weren't targeting my downed characters, but there were definitely times, the character down, the AI went and had an attack against that character, with a critical hit, so like one more attack would have finished them off, and then they moved away to another character. Maybe Larian had feedback saying that this was too harsh, but I mean obviously I kind of like that with characters able to survive, but at the end of the day it didn't feel too tactician-y to me, so I think it really could be improved. Tactician difficulty seems to give enemies more hit points. I've checked this against other difficulties, increases their attack rolls and their saving throws. The enemies have more items, there might be some other items littered around. But at the end of the day, I really think there could be one extra level of difficulty that's higher than the current tactician, or shift it around just to make it so it is that much more difficult and that much more deadly. I understand that isn't for everyone, and that's fine. We should all play the game in the way we want and do whatever we find most fun. Now, I probably wouldn't like to play on the most hardcore mode. I'm going to play Dark Souls 3 for example, but after a while I just got a bit bored of the repetitiveness of it all. So perhaps, for me personally, if it got too difficult, maybe I would actually not play the highest difficulty. I'm not so sure, but I would like to see one extra step up of difficulty. And I want to talk a bit more about reactivity also, and I think this is a massive positive point for Baldur's Gate 3. Because sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, you make choices and you don't know what the outcome's going to be. You might think you know what an outcome is or what the logical outcome might be. But it's a bit like real life where you make decisions and people react in different ways. Things happen that you can't predict. And I like having that level of kind of realism in the game. And I just want to quote Sven, like the CEO of Larian, something he said just before the game came out, and it's trust the dice. I did have moments during the game where something happened that I didn't want to happen, and at the end of the day, I just let it go. Let it happen. It was sad. Some of the things were sad. They weren't very nice, but that was part of my character's story. Just like in real life, bad things happen. Now I know people do play games as a form of escapism, so maybe they don't want those bad things to happen. And that's fine. You can reload the game, right? Save scumming, some people hate it, some people love it, but at the end of the day, it's a single player game. Well, if you're playing single player, and you do what makes you happy. There's no shame in save scumming. I did it maybe like once, particularly. Yeah, once particularly. At a certain point, I don't want to give any spoilers, but I'm glad I did because I ended up dying because of a certain conversation choice. Now, moving on to bugs. From what I remember, the first 2 acts were pretty bug-free for the most part. I don't really remember any big bugs. But in Act 3, and this is a common complaint really, Act 3 did have some bugs for me. Some of the big ones were actually to do with conversations, and again, don't want to give any spoilers, so don't worry, but I was having a conversation about how I'd saved someone, but in the game, I had no idea where to find this person. I had not come across them yet. Yeah, I was being told, oh yeah, well, you've saved that person. Like, no, I really haven't. I haven't come across them yet. And I ended up saving them later, sure. But that wasn't the only time that happened. There were several conversations really out of order. One bug I did have slightly earlier on is in the camp, I kept having an exclamation mark above Will. He kept on wanting to speak to me in camp. I'd go and speak to him, and a certain dialogue option was always there at the very top. And the next long rest, it was there again, and again, and again. I ended up just ignoring him after a while. And another bug I had was, again, in Act 3, trying to save some people. I opened up where they were being held, and they just stood there, like lemons. Like, alright, doors open. And they're even making comments about having to get out of there. Nothing happened. I do think that since playing that section, Larian have released a hotfix that's supposed to fix that. So perhaps if I went back and did it again, it wouldn't happen. And I do want to praise Larian. They have been putting out hotfixes. They've actually got some patches ready, or they're working on some patches. And for example, just the other day before making this video, they released a hotfix, hotfix 4, and it was breaking saves. I wasn't playing at the time, I was actually quite lucky. And they made a statement saying what happened, explaining to us, and it's nice to hear that from Larian. I'm going to be honest, during early access, they were fairly quiet about a lot of things. It was only during the panels from hell where we really got some information. Outside of that, it was very, very rare for us to be given any sort of update like that. So it's nice to see that now the game is fully released, they are a bit more open with their communication. And sticking with Act 3 just for a second, I had massive game performance issues when I first got to Act 3, but after playing some more and a couple of hotfixes later, it seems to have mostly cleared up. It's definitely better than when it started. And I was definitely having some memory leaks where the game would slow down the longer and longer I was playing. It'd restart the game and it'd get better. That doesn't seem to happen as much in certain areas are kind of more prone to the lower frame rates, but generally it's been very, very good. As I mentioned earlier, Larian did make a lot of changes from 5th edition. A lot of them are quite minor and quite detailed. And I'm just going to say a few of the changes that I actually do like. And the main one is probably the monk. The monk is touted as being the weakest class in 5th edition. And you shouldn't play certain subclasses because they're just awful. Now, in Baldur's Gate 3, I do think they've done the monk, they've done a good service, I'd say. They've made some changes, they've given them more key points, given them more options, extra abilities, class abilities at different levels, and it kind of makes them feel fleshed out, and they've put loads of good items for monks, or anyone who's kind of unarmed, but some of them were definitely made for monks. And there's a certain build at the moment, it might be changed with patches in the future, using the Tavern Brawler, getting loads of strengths, items that add damage to your unarmed attacks, and you can become a real powerhouse as a monk, especially open-hand monk. Another change I like is that in the video game we do have lots of uses of our bonus action, because in 5th edition some classes pretty much have nothing to do with their bonus actions a lot of the time, for example wizards. And now it's not like we're going to necessarily use our bonus action every single time, but it makes it feel more useful. Some classes are very overloaded with bonus actions, and actually monks are one of them now. And I like that change. I like the fact that there's more to do, and the fact that this is a video game means we're not having to wait minutes and minutes waiting for somebody to make a decision about what they're going to do with their bonus action and action. It's a lot quicker playing Baldur's Gate 3. And lastly, some of you might disagree with this change. It's a very big change actually, but with multi-classing we have no limit based on our stats. And I think this is kind of important because we can't roll for stats, which some people like, some people don't like. I'm kind of ambivalent about it because I never actually rolled for stats when playing D&D. I always just used the stat array or like point buy system. And now that we don't have to have certain stats, it means we can actually make different builds. It's opened up a lot more builds that we can now try out and do because we're not restricted by our stats. And the fact that we have a lot of different class abilities means things have changed. So Baldur's Gate 3 isn't a direct copy of D&D 5th edition. It's heavily based on it. But they've made their own changes, added their own abilities, and they've had to translate some things for the computer game because you can't do some things in a computer game like you could in Dungeons and Dragons, like Divine Intervention, the cleric level, I think level 11, level 10 ability, where in a tabletop game you would discuss this with your DM, the DM can play as your god, but in Baldur's Gate 3 you just have certain things you can use, and that's fine. I'm okay with these sorts of changes because we are playing a computer game, we're not playing and talking to a real person. But it's not all smelling of roses when it comes to changes to D&D 5th edition. Some of my pet peeves that I don't want to go through a long list, but a few things that kind of I don't really agree with. Is one thing, I kind of understand why this has happened, but I'm still a bit sad about it. But one thing I don't particularly like is that we don't have all the spells from the player's handbook even, let alone from the other source books, which we weren't expecting much from the other source books. But there's loads of spells missing. Loads, like half of them aren't there. Some of them, I understand, will be very difficult to implement in the game, and that's fine. And I understand some of the spells probably take a lot of time to prepare because you've got to have animations for it, the sounds, and all that stuff, and you've got to code it in. I'm not a game developer, I don't know everything, so I understand they had to make cuts, but it still hurts a bit. I would like to see more spells if it's possible in the future. One other thing that's confused me for a long time is with hand crossbows in particular. Now, I don't particularly mind that we can use a bonus action to shoot a hand crossbow, and that we don't have to reload. What I don't understand is that we still get our dexterity modifier added to our offhand attack with the hand crossbow. Whereas for a melee weapon, you have to get a fighting style to get that. Yet, somehow, magically, everyone gets it now in Baldur's Gate 3. It's pretty much worth equipping every character who isn't using their bow for something else, like their main attack. Equip the characters with hand crossbows. I did it with Gale, my wizard. If he had a bonus action free, sure, takes a shot. Sometimes it worked, and it's great. But I don't understand why he had his dexterity bonus added to it. I don't know, pet peeve of mine. I'll still play with it, I'll still use it, but I kind of not really sure why it's there. And one thing I'm kind of on the fence about a little bit is the critical successes and failures for skill checks. Because in 5th edition, the only automatic crits you have are, what, attack rolls and death saving throws, I think. Those are the ones that are in the player's handbook. A lot of tables do use, it is a house rule, of having a critical success or failure on a skill check. But when I've invested my class, my expertise, and my stats and items to be really good at, let's say, I don't know, lockpicking, why is it 5% of the time I fail? Now I can change that, I can get advantage, I can maybe take a halfling, but you know, again, I'm using more resources to stop that from happening. But on the other hand, this critical successes really did help me a few times in the game. I don't think it's really fair to have one without the other. So yeah, I'm a little bit ambivalent. At first I was like, oh, I don't really like it, but having played through, yeah, I'm kind of starting to change my mind, but it still frustrates me a lot when I get the ones, those critical misses on skill checks where I should be probably normally succeeding. Companions, right. You probably have your favourite companion, the one you hate the most, and you know what, they probably deserve it from your point of view, and that's okay. And I think it's fine to make companions that you don't like. But yeah, they've all got more depth to them than you might think. Even Lae'zel. Even the one that people like the least, she's actually got more to her than just being a mindless warrior for the good Yankee. I had fun, actually, getting to know the companions as the game progressed, but one kind of, again, quibble I would have with the game is, it is a bit of a chore to go and swap characters out, and after a while, I really just stopped doing it, because I don't want to have to move my items from one character into an inventory, onto another character, because I might want to use the same items. It's a bit of hassle. Like inventory management could definitely be improved. Going kind of linking to something else that I find a little bit frustrating. Now it's better than early access because you really had to drag one at a time. Or right click one at a time, send to camp, send to Lae'zel, send to whoever. At least now we can multi-select items, which is nice, it's a good improvement, but I would like to see it just a little bit better, a little bit easier to transfer characters rather than having to go to camp and go through that process. And so yeah, at the end of the day, I pretty much mostly used Gale, Lae'zel and Shadowheart. I did start off with Karlach, and I did change to Minsk for a little bit, and actually no, I didn't use Jaheira because it just got a bit of a hassle to change between everyone. Maybe if I had different items for different people, I'd be a bit more open to it. But it's just, I'm just going to stick with the characters I've got because I can't be bothered to change characters. And linked to the inventory is the items. The items are a bit frustrating sometimes. And it's not the magical items, they're fine, there's loads of them. I think it's great actually. But it's the more mundane items where we're not quite sure what they do. Now, I've played through Early Access a lot, I've played through the game now, I know what items are useful and which are not. Now, I started a multiplayer game with some friends I've got who I've played D&D with, and they were asking me, ooh, what about the hammer, is that useful? Ooh, what about rope? Ooh, what about the gems? What about these ingots? And like, there's nothing in the game to help us out here. And rope is like a staple of D&D play. You take rope is great. Lord of the Rings, Sam says you need some rope. And we have rope in Baldur's Gate 3, but it doesn't do anything. It's a bit sad, because I think Dungeons & Dragons players especially are kind of expecting rope to be able to do something, but unfortunately it doesn't. So I'd like kind of some guide or in-game label for items that kind of are junk, items to be sold to a merchant because they're worth some money. And the gems in Dungeons & Dragons can be used sometimes for some spells, and we don't have materials, and I kind of get that. I think it would be a bit mundane to go around collecting lots of materials for your spells. In the end, everyone would probably just have a component pouch or an arcane focus. But the crafting we do have for alchemy, I kind of like it. Yes, we're going around collecting, but I feel like, oh, there's a herb, I'll go and pick it up. I don't have to worry about recipes, and that's something that kind of frustrated me about Divinity Original Sin 2. There's all this crafting and it's great, but I've got too many recipes actually. Whereas in Baldur's Gate 3, the alchemy is simple but rewarding. Sure, I collect these things, it makes some ingredients, some reagents, and then we can make some potions. That's cool. And you can check through the potions which ones do you want to make. And I kind of like that system. Maybe it's a bit too simple for some people. I can understand if people want it more in depth. But for me, it's kind of just about the perfect balance between simplicity and not getting too involved and too complicated. So now I'm going to speak a little bit about the ending. Not really in terms of story, but yeah, I'm going to speak about the ending. So if you want no look ahead, no spoilers whatsoever, there's barely going to be any spoilers, but if you don't want to know anything about the ending, look away now, just skip to later to my final thoughts. And I'm going to agree with some other posts and comments you might have read online about the ending, because it's so short. Like, the amount of time we get in the cutscene at the end, considering we've just played, oh, I played 85 hours, that was the in-game save time, it probably took about 100. We played for so long, and we get some of them just like 2 or 3 sentences, and they're gone. Sure, I know what they're going to do next, that's kind of cool, but what about the effects on the whole world? What about the long-term effects? I don't know if they're trying to leave things open for Baldur's Gate 4 or something, but for example, going back to Baldur's Gate 2, we got this epilogue of what happened in their lives, and we got like hear of some of their legends and stories. But here, I'm not going to talk about any individual character, but like it's basically like, oh yeah, see ya, bye. So I want to know more. Please let me know. And I also did have a bug here where I didn't get to hear from Shadowheart because something happened with, I think it's Karlach. And I just didn't hear anything from her. Great, thanks. I assume that's going to be patched out. I very much assume that is going to be patched out. So I feel like I've spent quite a lot of this time going over some of the things I don't like, perhaps more than the things I do like, but I do just want to say this is a fantastic game, almost certainly, probably at the moment, top of my list of games that I like playing. And all of these negatives really come from a place of love and wanting to see the game improve. Now I know Larian aren't going to listen to my feedback specifically, but in the event that they hear of anything that I've said here, it really is to try and make the game better for everyone. And I just want to say, never have I ever been willing to sacrifice so much sleep to play a game. Now, I do have a full-time job, and I think in the first 2 weeks I played 100 hours, is what Steam told me, which is an average of 7 hours a day, and that's including having work on most of those days. So, I mean, like, this game is absolutely amazing, and I would definitely recommend you to play it. And I really like seeing posts on Reddit where people start with the post title like, oh, I don't like this type of game. And in the post they say like, oh yeah, I mean, someone recommended it, I didn't really expect much, probably going to get a refund or something. And then all of a sudden it's 30 hours later and they're playing and they love it. And I think that's really like what Baldur's Gate 3 does to you. It kind of grabs you and pulls you into the world. You want to know what happens. And I find the gameplay really interesting. And it really is a role-playing game. We get to make our decisions, we get to play a role that we want. And those decisions have consequences, or for better or for worse. I want to say I love the voice acting. The music is like second to none. Thank you, Borislav Slavov, and anyone else who worked on the music. You've done the game a great service. Really like it. The magic items they've added into the game have been really good. There's so many items to be looking for, and this included with the multi-classing and the fact that we don't need stats to multi-class. And the changes that they've made, I could be in this game forever almost. Now, the number of different builds and different things I can try, different routes through the game is really, really high. And it's a very expansive game, I think is a good way to describe it. And there's so much to see and to explore. And I really, really would recommend this to anybody who's even got an inkling of playing. If you've made it this far, please consider subscribing. Let me know your thoughts on the game, because I'm sure many of you have thoughts on what you did like, what you didn't like, whether you agree with what I've said. Thank you to the members of my channel, you really do help support me. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I'll catch you in the next one.